Hey guys, and welcome to Carrier Routing 101. This is going to be the Dojo intro video on how to rat anomalies in nullsec with a carrier. If you're watching this video, I'm going to assume that you're already familiar with both ratting basics and capital basics, so I'm not going to be going over things like how anomalies work, how bounties work, how site spawning works, or any capital basics like how jump drives, jump range, capital skills work. This is just going to be a video for the specifics of how to use a carrier to rat. Now in this video I'm going to be using a Nidhogger. This is the Minmatar carrier, and it is the preferred ratting carrier just because it has the racial bonus of fighter velocity. But the other races' carriers will do similar damage, but they all have different bonuses instead of this velocity, and they're not as good as velocity for ratting. So the Nidhogger is definitely the preferred carrier if you're going to rat with it. And there's two main fits you can use. One is the NSA fit, like I have here. You got an NSA in the highs to lock stuff because you're a carrier. Then 3 fighter support units, a Sino for safety, and then your tank is all buffer. So the rigs are all core defense field extender 1s. The mid slots, you got 2 capital shield extender 2s, and a thermal and EM ward field. Of course, this is cheese tanked for Sancha rats, so depending on the rats in your area, you might want to fit different resistances. Then I've got a drone nav to help the fighters move faster, a tracking link and a tracking enhancer to help the fighters track better, and then 4 DDAs in the low. Now this is a pretty cheap fit, relatively, for a ratting Nidhogger. If you're going to upgrade anything, the first thing you're going to want to start with is you're going to want a faction or faction or abyssal, these DDAs down here. That's pretty much the only thing you can really do to increase your damage outside of skills. That being said, the fighters you use are also pretty important. I'm using Templar 1s. Obviously, Tech 2 fighters are going to give you more damage. And if you can, use fighter support unit 2s. Those will give you even more damage and fighter rate of fire, fighter shield recharge, and velocity. So they're pretty all-around buff to your fighters. The other fit that people use to carrier rat now that the NSA was nerfed. For those who don't know, the NSA now, while it's active, prevents you from warping. So once you activate it, you get better scan res, but for a minute, you're tackled. People generally don't like to be tackled in their capitals, so another fit that people have been using that I don't actually have on hand right now is they take out the NSA and they put 2 or 3 SIBOs in the mid slots. That's sensor boosters with scan res scripts. It still won't be as good scan res as the NSA, but you won't be tackled while they're active, and also they don't use up nearly as much cap as the NSA. Actually, they use basically nothing compared to your carrier's cap. So that means you're always at jump cap while you're ratting. So even if there's a bunch of nukes popping system, you can choose to warp off, but if for some reason you feel like that would be unsafe, you can just jump out immediately. So those are going to be the 2 main fits for carrier ratting. Varying levels of bling and skills will affect your ticks and DPS. Now obviously the biggest change going from other ratting ships like a rattlesnake or a VNI into a carrier is going to be the fighters. Fighters are similar to drones and also very different. So I'm going to quickly go over how fighters work. When you're in a carrier, you have a fighter bay, and the fighter bay has some pretty large capacity which can be increased with skills. And then you have 3 launch tubes in a carrier. These are basically referred to as squads or squadrons of fighters, and you have to load fighters into tubes to be able to launch them into space. So if I take these out, I have empty tubes and all my fighters are in my bay. Now if I want to actually use my fighters, I have to load these into each of the tubes, and they take some time to load. So be mindful if you have empty tubes when you're starting out. I'm going to wait for these to load up. So now I've got my 3 tubes fully loaded, almost here. Each tube holds 9 fighters, so with 3 tubes it's a total of 27 fighters. And once they're in your tube, they don't consume space in your fighter base, so you can hold extras in case you lose some, or just in case of combat. Now, to control these fighters, you'll get a UI that looks like this. You can drag it around here, but this shows you your 3 squadrons of fighters. They start out in your tube, so if you want to launch them, you select the tube, and you can either right-click, launch squadron, or you can just click this button, which launches all your fighters, or you can hotkey it. I have it on Control-Shift-S to launch all my fighters into space. And then once they're in space, by default, they'll just orbit you at 500. And from here on out is where things get very different from drones. These fighters have no AI. You control these fighters directly. So if these fighters are out in space and you get attacked, your drones will, or your fighters will not automatically retaliate. You have to control these yourself. So that might seem like it's a little harder, but it's actually amazing because you can give these fighters commands just like you could give to any ship. So for example, I'm going to select all my fighters here and tell them to approach a spot in space, and they'll go do that. I don't have to move my ship or do anything with my ship here. I can give my fighters commands individually. I can, just select the Squadron 3, have him move over here while the other 2 fighters are moving over there. And then I can just recall them like normal. Fighters are pretty fast, even without their MWD on, which I'll explain in a second. They move at around 2.2K, plus or minus depending on skills, of course. But you can also control fighters out to a really, really far range. You'll notice that if you have tactical overlay, when you get into a carrier, your tactical overlay extends out to 2,000 kilometers. I don't remember the exact control range, but you can control fighters from really far away. Much, much more than regular drones. Now, if I have these fighters out in space, you'll notice that they have these 3 modules each here. The first one is their weapon. So it's the pulse cannon. These are Amar drones, so they have laser weapons. This is just their primary weapon. It does damage, doesn't ever run out of ammo, and cannot be overheated or anything. It's just their basic attack. The second module is the marker warp drive. This will increase their speed to something really high, like 12,000 meters per second for a short time. And then after you use it, there's a short cooldown period before it can be used again. And I'll demonstrate this in a second. All the light fighters also have a F3, which is their heavy rocket salvo. It's just a rocket salvo. You activate on a target, they shoot a bunch of rockets, and then after a short cooldown period, you can use them again. And each fighter only holds 12 rocket salvos. So once you use those, the only way to get more is to recall the fighters into your carrier and wait for them to reload. This doesn't cost anything except time. So, you're not spending money on these rockets. They're technically unlimited. They just have to be reloaded. You'll also notice that once I landed my fighters back into my tubes, there's a short period of time while they're refueling. The longer your fighters are out in space, the longer that refuel timer will be. So if you just pull them out and then put them back in, the timer is something like 5 seconds. But if they're out for quite a while, like the duration of one sight, it'll take them a solid minute in order to refuel. During that time, you cannot unload them, you cannot launch them, you cannot do anything with them. So be aware that they're using up your tube and they're not in space, so you're quite defenseless while your fighters are reloading. Hopefully, though, you should never need to fight while your fighters are reloading. I'm going to show one of the micro warp drives real quick, just to show you how fast they go, because it's really quite absurd. So I'm going to launch the first squadron, have him move pretty far out. So here's his normal speed. I'm going to activate the micro warp drive, and that's his new speed. It's going 13,000 meters per second. I'm going to recall him here so I don't have to wait for him to fly back, but you can see the duration of the MWD there. That's the duration of it, and then once it finishes, there will be a cooldown timer. One of the biggest mistakes that new carrier pilots make is that they will confuse controlling their fighters with controlling their carrier. Obviously, since you can control the ships, your fighters like normal ships, the commands can get intertwined. So in your hotkeys window, there's a specific tab for fighters, and you'll want to find a setup that works for you and make sure that you memorize these hotkeys. The important one is going to be toggle selection of the fighters. For like Squadron 1, I just have it set to 1, 2, and 3, and then also toggle ship selection. So what toggle ship selection does is it toggles whether you're controlling your own carrier itself. So I'm going to press the hotkey now. You see this blue aura appear around the capacitor. That means I'm currently controlling my ship. So if I now make a command to move here, that's going to tell my ship to start moving. I can press the hotkey again to deselect my carrier, and now any movement commands that I give, if I have fighters out in space, will not be given to my ship. So you're going to want to be careful to make sure that you're controlling the right thing. You know, when you're telling your fighters to orbit some rat, you don't want to have your carrier also be commanded to go orbit that rat, because then you'll be in probably some trouble. So get used to, set your hotkeys to something that you can easily remember, and then get used to them and practice using them, because when you're in a panic, you don't notice your ship selected, you don't select the right fighters, that will cause you trouble, because this is just vastly different from how you control normal ships. One last thing before I actually start the site is that these fighters actually have hotkeys for their weapons as well. So you'll notice now if I have my carrier unselected and my fighter selected, instead of clicking on these modules, you'll see that they have key bindings just like your regular modules. I can press F2 to turn on all their prop mods. It's a lot easier than clicking through this interface, but you're free to do whatever you want. So now I'm going to start doing a site. Carriers work best in sanctums and havens, and only rock havens for that matter. I prefer sanctums. They tend to give me slightly higher ticks. The fact that the rats spawn pretty far from each other doesn't matter for carriers because fighters are really fast. And one big problem with rock havens is that your fighters tend to get stuck in the asteroids, and then they stop moving, which means the rats can deal a lot of damage to them. I don't think I've ever lost a fighter in a sanctum, but especially when I first started out, I lost quite a few in rock havens. And don't be worried if you lose fighters. Like, every single person who's ever started riding with carriers loses fighters. That's just how it works. Make sure you buy a bunch of extras. Like, I lost something like 20 fighters before I really got the hang of it and stopped losing them. Don't be worried about losing fighters. That's just a natural thing. So you'll notice I warped to the site at 20. I just don't want to land at 0 on an object and like bounce super far off. It's also worth noting that I have this location window pulled up. These are my safes in system. As soon as I land, I'm going to start aligning out towards a safe, and I'll explain why after I get this site set up. So here are the rats, landing slightly off of them. First thing I'm going to do, well, for now I can activate my hardeners and my tracking enhancer. I'm going to align out to a safe. Going to launch all my fighters, drop my MTU, and turn on my NSA and lock the rats. I never draw my MTU. There we go. So as soon as you land, you can start aggroing your fighters on things. And I'll explain the priority of rats in a second here. But remember to bookmark your MTU. Now the first thing I'm going to do once I land, and the first thing you should do in any wave, is kill the battlecruisers. Battlecruisers take a lot of damage from these fighters because they are battleship sized, and so the fighters hit them for full application, and they also have very little tank. So set one fighter on each battlecruiser. That'll give it plenty of DPS to kill it, and you're not wasting any DPS. And then once all the battlecruisers are dead, you move on to battleships. Now battleships should still only take 3 or 4 volleys from your fighters to kill. Carriers mow through them pretty quickly, and then just move them on to the next battleship. For the torpedo salvos, I tend to use like all of my fighters' torpedoes together. Some people don't like to do that, but I find it to be easier. And my general rule of thumb for sanctums is that I use torpedo salvos if there are 3 or more battleships left. And that's just a way to sort of mitigate incoming DPS while preserving rocket salvos. You never want to finish a site with rockets left, because that means you could have finished it faster than you did. So I find, if there's 3 or more, I'll use rockets, otherwise I'll just use lasers. Now you'll also notice that in between killing rats, I'm having my fighters orbit the next target. You never want to have your fighters be standing still. If they're standing still, they can get shot, and these battleships can hit them really hard. So when this rat's almost dead, I'm going to have them start orbiting this rat at just 500. You don't need to use the prop here. The battleships can't hit them if they're orbiting that close. So I accidentally spawned the next wave before I finished the first one, but that's fine. Same as before, I'm going to lock up the battlecruisers first. It's also worth noting that I'm just leaving my NSA running. That's generally not the best idea. You can just pulse it to only activate it when you need the scan res, so that way you're not tackled all the time. But I don't really care. I'm going to open up local though, just to make sure that no nukes come through. So now 1 fighter on each battlecruiser. They still die pretty quickly. I think it's like 3 shots. Maybe 4. Nope, 3 shots. And then onto this battleship. Gonna use rockets on him. Start orbiting the next one. Firing rockets and lasers. Same thing goes for all the rest of the waves. Now, earlier I mentioned that I am aligning to one of my safes instead of these Fortizar in system. And the reason for that is, since I'm NSA fit, if a nuke comes into system, there's a possibility that my NSA is mid-cycle and I cannot warp off for a solid 20 to 30 seconds. So assuming they don't come and tackle me during that time, it's possible that they're warping a saber to the station in system and bubbling the undock. If they do that and then I try to warp directly to the station, I'm totally fucked. So first I line out to my random safe and warp there if I need to. From there, I can warp to the fort, and by then, not only am I at a random angle that they probably didn't bubble, but also my aggression timer is totally down. Wait, sorry, no, there's no aggression timer. It's just for the benefit of the saber bubbling in path. So you notice that spawn was kind of far away from the last one, so I just turned my prop mods on for this wave to get them closer. These loyal cruisers can be kind of annoying. They're elite cruisers, so they have quite a bit of tank. I prefer to just set all 3 fighters on each of these to kill them faster. And there you can see, after I use the MWD, that's the cooldown bar around it. I don't remember the exact number, but I think you can have about 25% MWD uptime. And also, you can have your things be attacking different targets. Like there, while I was having my fighters use the lasers on the cruisers, I was firing rocket salvos at this battleship. And we'll just keep burning through the waves like this. It's also worth noting that these rocket salvos do have a range. I believe it's something like 12,000 heavy rocket salvo, 13 kilometers, 13.75. So if they're outside of that range, nothing happens. Finishing off this last battleship of this wave. And this should spawn the next wave here. You'll want to take out these frigates first as well, but even with the NSA, they take some time to lock. And while you're locking the frigates, there's a couple seconds where you can't actually fire at them, but you have a battleship locked. So I prefer to just start attacking the battleship, take one down first, so I don't waste any DPS. Then I'm putting one fighter on each frigate. These should die fairly quickly, even though, they're frigates and quite hard to apply to. Your fighter should be able to do it, especially with the tracking link and tracking enhancer in this fit. Now I'm putting one fighter on the remaining frigate, and the other two on this battleship. I'm going to have them all fire rockets at this battleship as well. Now there was a little bit of micromanagement by me. I had the third squadron of fighters attacking this frigate, which is right next to me, but I told all my fighters to orbit that battleship, which is 30 k's away. So since I told my fighter to be over there, he's orbiting that battleship, but he's trying to shoot this fighter, which is 30 k's away, far outside the optimal. So he was doing no damage. I had to quickly bring that fighter squadron back in range of the frigate to kill him. So you're going to want to make sure to avoid micromanagement mistakes like that. And if I'm not mistaken, the next wave should be the last wave. Last wave and Sanctums and Havens are always the biggest wave of them all, but having plenty of battleships and battle cruisers is not difficult for a carrier. And so here it is. There's a bunch of frigates, a couple battle cruisers. I'm going to have them MWD over. One on each frigate. And this one finished, so I'll set him on this battle cruiser. This one finished, I'll put him on this one. And the third squadron on this one. And then I'm going to lock my new set of targets. So if you're looking at this, you'll probably notice that it is a lot of micromanagement. Fighter micro is definitely just, it's the hardest part of carrier in general, not just carrier ratting. So it's something you're going to have to get used to. I found, though, that for a long time before I flew a carrier, I flew a rattlesnake. And the sentry micromanagement in rattlesnakes, especially in dead sites where aggro is pretty random, I found that helped me a lot to transition into fighter management. Since I'm on the last wave, I'm going to go ahead and deactivate my NSA. Probably won't need it again. And then after I clear out the rest of these battleships, I will be done with the site. Now the ticks that you can expect out of a carrier are generally, well, first of all, it'll be highly skill dependent, but an intro level carrier with maybe pretty low skills can expect 30 to 35 million ticks. That's per 20 minutes, which is it's pretty good, especially compared to other types of ratting. But you are flying a 1.5 billion ship, so you eventually want to skill up a bit and upgrade your fit so that you start getting higher ticks. Once you get about mid skills and you get better at managing your fighters, you should expect maybe 40, maybe 45 million ticks. Currently, at least before the NSA nerf and fighter application nerf a couple weeks ago, I was getting about 55 million ticks, and this is with a full Tech 2 fit, no bling. My fighter skill is only 4, so I'm only using Tech 1 fighters. My carrier skill is only 4. After the nerf, I'm getting maybe 45-ish million ticks, which is still pretty good. Once you upgrade to a blingy fit, though, or get Tech 2 fighters and up your skills pretty high, you can expect 50, to 55 million ISK ticks pretty regularly. And then the loot from each site, adds a little bit too. These sites take me on average 10 minutes to run, so I carry a set of 6 MTUs when I do rats, and I just do 6 sites in a row. After I finish the 6 sites, I dock my carry up and grab an industrial and just scoop all my MTUs and all the loot. It's an average of maybe 5 to 6 mil per site in loot. I don't bother salvaging, but that's also another good source of ISK. So, site's done. All the rats are dead. I didn't get a faction spawn or a dread spawn or an escalation, which, it's fine. You normally won't get those. I recalled my fighters to prop on to get them faster, and you can see they're taking a really long time to reload now because I had them out in space for so long and used up all their missiles. And I'm going to go ahead and warp off to my safe, even though there's no newts in system. And I'm out of the site. So that is a quick tutorial on how to rat havens and sanctums in a carrier. I did a sanctum in this video, but rock havens are pretty much the same thing. The only difference is that you will not have to move your fighters around because all the enemies spawn inside the asteroid. And that's all I got for this video. So definitely, if you're looking to get into this, do some practice. If you can get onto CC and practice some fighter management, practice some ratting and carriers, it's definitely suggested. It's a pretty different system to regular ships and regular ratting. So you want to get a bit of practice and do some reading. Also, of course, you want to do it somewhere safe. Be watching local all the time. That's basic ratting stuff. You should already know that. So that'll be the end of this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope you learned something.